Welcome to our 2026 Metrics That Matter learning series. We are really excited to have this theme this year, and we're going to be talking about all the different ways that you can measure organizational resilience to drive both preparedness and innovation. I am your speaker. I will be your speaker for several of them this year, but we will also have a guest speaker as well. So we are going to look at those metrics. Interestingly enough, a lot of the work that we're doing here at I-Corps is being used to update and write some of the international standards where we're starting to look at resilience and how we measure those capabilities. And so it's been really exciting to see the global acceptance of the metrics that we've created that we're going to begin sharing with you today. So this is our learning series. You can see the Measuring Resilience Learning Badge will be a badge that you can earn this year if you attend a combination of in-person and on demand. It is up to you how you'd like to attend. So today we're going to look at the introduction to the metrics, and it's going to be, I just want you to know that this year's webinars are going to be much more interactive because you're going to have a chance to do some scoring of your own organization or just to understand some of the metrics that we're looking at. So just in preparation for that, we're going to do 15 different polls today. We're answering 15 different questions, and you might want to record kind of the scores that you get on those. I'm just giving you a heads up on the front end. Next month, we're going to look at leadership and strategy metrics that are under Dimension 1. And then in April, we're going to look at culture and organizational behavior metrics, which is part of Dimension 2, which I'll talk more about. And then in May, we're very excited because we'll have our guest speaker who's going to talk about best practices for both of those dimensions and what those look like in organizations as an expert who has completed many of those assessments. In June, we're going to focus on Dimension 3, infrastructure metrics. In July, probably your favorite will be the preparedness and managing risk metrics for Dimension 4. And then we'll do again the best practices in August for Dimensions 3 and 4. And then in September, we'll finish up by looking at Dimension 5, and then the best practices in October for Dimension 5. And then as kind of a bonus would be, how do you really build an agile performance improvement process, and looking at the metrics for how you might be able to do that. So today we're going to be looking at an introduction to the Organizational Resilience Capability Assessment. The acronym isn't my favorite, but it's what it is, the ORCA metrics. And our purpose today is to learn about how I-Corps measures organizational resilience using that capability assessment tool. I'm going to introduce each of the 5 dimensions of that tool, and after each dimension, we're going to look at a sample strategy, and then we're going to drill down and look at a single capability, and then several different behavior metrics. We'll be measuring 1 capability and 2 behavior metrics for each of those strategies. And this is where you'll have the opportunity to answer questions about that capability and those behaviors to see how you score. Really what I want you to get out of this today is a broader understanding of organizational resilience and those capabilities and behaviors that provide the data and the metrics for how you can measure your current state and help you start planning for your future state. Our organizational resilience capability assessment has 348 resilience metrics. I would have liked to have 350 just to make it an even number, but you know, we grabbed the ones, we're using the ones that make sense. And so it's really important for you to provide a baseline for your organization so that you understand your strengths and weaknesses so that you can build and strengthen your organization for that continuous improvement. There are these 5 dimensions. They're the 5 outer rings that have the different colors. Within each of those dimensions, we have 3 strategies. So there's a total of 15 strategies. And within each of those 15 strategies, there's 5 capabilities. So that's where we get the 75 capabilities. And then we have 6 behavior categories, But each of those behavior categories has its own metrics, and there's 273 total for those. When we look at our scoring, we're going to be looking at a 3-point scoring. A lot of people like to do 5 levels, and they talk about maturity models and that sort of thing. We have decided to keep it very simple, a 1, a 2, or a 3. And after the pandemic, we adjusted the scoring a little bit because we found that too many people were getting level 3, that optimized score, when they were still having some pretty large gaps. So we've made it more difficult to get that 3 stars or the optimized rating. So the level 1, or your score number 1, is kind of that initial ad hoc, where what you're doing is more reactive and intuitive, and you're addressing performance issues. So you're reacting. And so this is where you'd give yourself a score if you see that evident 0 to 49% of the time. So whatever the capability is, you're going to look at it. Do we do this all the time, some of the time, or not very often? Level 2 is when you see this behavior evident 50 to 89% of the time, and this is where you're starting to put in measures and you're becoming more capable. So you're using quantitative measures, and you've defined what it is that you're looking at. So here's where you're focusing on both project and organizational performance objectives while using that data and metrics for your measurement. And then 3 is where you're both stable as well as flexible and efficient. So you've got these 3 different things that are often contradictory, but you need to be stable, you need to be flexible and adaptive, and you also need to be efficient in how you're doing your work. And so here you're going to give yourself a 3 if it's evident 90% or more of the time. And the idea that you're balancing consistency and flexibility to drive innovation is the key part of that. When we look at our behavior scoring, we're also using those same 3 metrics. So again, you're seeing this behavior evident 0 to 49% of the time, 50 to 89% of the time, or 90% or more of the time. The sets of behaviors that we have, in fact, originally we had like 14 of them, and we decided to bundle them together. When we started looking at how would you measure those, we found that they're kind of made sense to put them into some groupings. So being adaptable and flexible, we defined that as the ability to change, evolve, and adapt in response to changing circumstances. And there are 40 different metrics to score against those. We also look at being both inclusive and collaborative. I really like this idea of inclusive collaboration. It's really easy to collaborate with people that you like and who think like you. And you can really give yourself a pat on the back with saying, you know, this is how collaborative I am. But if you're not including everyone, you're not truly collaborative. And so there are 57 different measures for how to be both inclusive and collaborative, and having people work together towards that common purpose or goal so that you have that shared ownership and that joint vision of what it is that you're doing. And we've combined being both aware and reflective, which are kind of opposites, but we want you to be able to anticipate the future conditions as well as learn from the past experiences. And there are 47 different measures for that. And then we bundled resourceful, creative, and innovative. This is the idea of having the ability to find different ways to achieve objectives under those changing circumstances. And we have 38 measures for that. A lot of times when people talk about diverse, they're looking at being, you know, diversity, equity, and inclusion type of things. We've really bundled these separate because we want you to look at diversity outside of that particular acronym, and making sure that you understand the diverse nature of your organization, the diverse nature of what it is that you're producing or selling, as well as making sure that you're integrating. So here it's kind of tying to that being collaborative piece, but making sure that you're both diverse and integrated so that you're all working together. And then finally, the prepared, robust, and redundant. That you've got plans of action are in place in advance of them being needed, and that your strategies are both robust and redundant. So here we have our 15 resilient strategies. And as we go through this year's series of webinars, we will be talking about each of these. But today we're giving you a snapshot to look at. So we're going to start with leadership and strategy, and then talk about what the outcome of understanding of context and relationships looks like. So what we've done for each of our strategies is to create an outcome statement. This is your goal. This is what you're trying to accomplish, that you have a comprehensive understanding of your relationship with the multiple aspects of the ecosystem. I'm using the word ecosystem. A lot of people use the word, whole of organization or whole of society. The idea is, we're gonna talk about this in a second, but everything about your organization and everybody you interact with. Because you need to have an understanding of the entire operational context in which your organization operates to achieve its objectives. And because this helps you to provide the context in which you can identify opportunities, or you can identify potential threats to the organization that might emerge and need to be managed. So when we're looking at context, that entire ecosystem, your industry, if you're in the financial industry, or you're in the supply chain industry, whatever industry you're operating in. And then we have this globe here because we want you to think very big. Do you have one location, or do you have many locations? Is your organization operating in more than one country? So looking at all of your ecosystem, everywhere that it operates, and making sure as a best practice that you have that customer focused or customer driven focus for your mission. And then looking at the organization itself. How do you organize the work? Are you in divisions? Are you in departments? Are you in, what does your organization look like? How do you do your work? And with the goal that you're trying to get rid of as many silos as you can and really work as a network as a multidisciplinary organization. And then we're looking at teams. We all work in teams. How do we work? How do we deliver that work? And making sure that our teams are working in a connected way. We all have leaders. Some of us are leaders. We're all leaders wherever we are, even if we're just leading ourselves. But looking at how is that work managed and led? And we want leaders who are less technical taskmasters and more inclusive. People who lead versus micromanage is probably the more familiar term that you might see. And then looking at the individual itself. How is work executed? And looking at your talent programs and how you manage your people. And we're going to talk a little bit about that today too, but we need resilient people who want to learn and grow and develop. So we have these three measures. We have our capability, number 7, which is that the organization's understanding of its context allows for the ability to think beyond its current activities, its current strategy, and its organizational boundaries. So like I said, there's 75 capabilities. This is capability number 7. And then we have 2 behaviors that are tied to this capability. The first one is inclusive and collaborative, and it's behavior number 7 under inclusive and collaborative, that there are opportunities for the organization's people, your staff, your employees, to get to know one another and to develop interpersonal relationships across the organization. I guess I would say that if this was 2019, you'd be going like, well, duh, of course we're doing this. But now that many of us are working remotely, it is harder to develop interpersonal relationships and to get to know each other outside of just meetings and the work that we do. And then under prepared, robust, and redundant, this behavior outcome is quite large. It's the first one under prepared, and it says that strategic decisions are based on robust, deep, broad, and far-sighted data and projections. That data is supported by science and policy, bringing together policymakers and the best possible science and data, and making sure that you're bringing in any existing joint strategic needs assessment or working groups that are doing this. So when we're talking about preparedness in this piece, we're talking about decisions and decisions that reflect strategy. So here is where I want you to get out of your managing risk bubble, if you're in one, and start thinking about prepared, robust, and redundant having to do also with how you operate. So we're going to go to our first set of polls, and there's going to be 3 of them, but the challenge I have is that we can only use so many text characters. And so, like, for example, the behavior outcome under prepared, robust, and redundant isn't going to fit. So we've spent a minute on it. I had to kind of combine, make it a little bit shorter so it would fit. So I'd like you to get ready to take our first poll. So give me a minute for this. And we are going to have to move pretty quickly because we do have 15 of these to go to, and we have a short period of time. So what you're going to talk about is that, to what extent does your organization's understanding of its context allow you to make decisions? And I'm guessing that most of you are going to give yourselves 2s. And I want you to think about this really seriously as you go through this. And I'm going to give about 10 seconds for each one. So I'm going to go 5, 4, 3, 2, and 1. And I'm going to go ahead and share those. So it's really interesting to see that 60% of you were in the middle, which is pretty much predicted, but that actually 10% of you felt that you're doing this 90% of the time. So that's interesting. Very nice. The second poll is going to be looking at the behaviors, and here's where we get somewhat down to what I'll call the behaviors are more the nitty-gritty part of things, where the attributes, I'm having a brain cramp. The other one is a little bit higher level. So here, do you have opportunities to get to know each other? Like I said, I do think that this is going to change. This has changed over the past, 5 or 6 years. So give about 2 more seconds for that one. This is really interesting because it was very much, you guys, like really across the board, almost 30% each. That's very interesting distributed. And then the third one, I have to close it first. Hang on. Sorry. And then looking at those strategic decisions and how robust those are. All right, about 2 more seconds. And interestingly here, we got 7% more picked that 90% more, which is interesting. So I'm not going to comment much about these. I guess I should share it. Sorry about that. I should have shared it with you before I started talking. Doing this 15 times today will keep me on my toes. So this gives you also an idea, not just to score your own organization, but also to think and kind of compare to what you look like with other organizations as well. So you can kind of benchmark a little bit. All right, let's move on to our next dimension. Next, we're going to talk about culture and organizational behavior and to what extent your organization shares information and knowledge. So the outcome statement for this is that information and knowledge is widely shared where appropriate and applied, that you have the ability to learn from experience, and learning from others is encouraged, which really enables effective decision making. So that's the outcome that we're looking at in order to look at the next piece, which is, I really like this picture, by the way. You're inside a silo. And I'm sure if you've worked on a farm or you've seen farms, they have these silos, and they can be pretty dangerous to be at the bottom of one of these. But the question on the table is, does your organization utilize a formal knowledge and information management process? Or are you stuck in your own knowledge and information silo? So here we have 4 behaviors that are tied to capability number 25. It says what we're trying to make sure is that the organization encourages the creation and sharing of lessons learned about success and failure, and promotes the adoption of better practice. Well, I wanted to just share a quick anecdote from 2021. I was speaking at a conference in Canada, and about half the people in the room were people who worked for the government or the public sector, as we sometimes call it, and the other half worked for the private sector. And it's a really interesting audience because you see things from different perspectives. And they were also interesting because they were sitting on different sides of the room. And I don't know if that was, I don't know if that was intentional or not, but I did find it interesting. But one of the questions I asked was that, to what extent have you been able to implement now that you're back at work in whatever format that looks like? Now that you're back at work, how have you been able to share the learnings from when you were working remotely? And the people on the private sector shared so many ideas and so many things, and they were very excited. And most of them were not back to work 100%. They were working, but they weren't working the same way that they were working before the pandemic. The people in the government or the public sector were depressed. They just said, we just went back to doing everything the way we had done it before, and we didn't have the opportunity to share with each other what we had learned and to move ahead. We just had to go back to the way it was before. And I'm stereotyping a little bit, but that is what they said. So that is something that I really wanted to see as a takeaway, because I think it's important for us to think about that. Now there was a couple of questions. So one of the questions had to do with regarding employees getting to know each other. Is that related to continuity employees or the broader employee base, because they have 10,000 employees? I would say the people that you work with. You want to be able to get to know the people that you're on the same team with. I think that is very helpful. The other question had to do with that these responses are driven by our own subjective perspectives. Will you be discussing how to either make this more objective or to balance data with varying perspectives? So that's a really good question. And no matter what kind of assessment you do, it's going to be balanced by your opinion. And that's why when you do this formal assessment, you need to be asking more than one person. So each person's going to have their own opinion on these things. And that's why the multiple perspectives become very important. But let's look at the behavior outcomes. And so under inclusive and collaborative, to what extent do you guys offer to help others, which does result in that improved relationship across your teams and creates more efficient workflow that benefits the entire organization? Because we know that coordinating with others helps people to learn from each other. So you're really measuring here, how often, maybe you just measure yourself, how often do you offer to help others? And then when you're looking at what we were just talking about, to what extent does the organization encourage its people to talk to each other about what they've learned? So they'll be able to understand different perspectives as well as from the learnings themselves. And under aware and reflectives, do you ask colleagues for feedback or advice? Do you have the opportunity to observe how experienced employees display their skills and evaluate how others work to identify what to learn and how to learn from each other? As we're working remotely more and more, maybe less and less, depending on where you're at, it does make it more difficult to observe some of these things. And then finally, to what extent does your organization design agile and open knowledge management systems? So to what extent you have something formal in place that helps you to manage and share knowledge and to integrate those innovations that you have. So let's get to our next set of polls. So here is where you're going to be talking about, do we encourage the creation and sharing of lessons learned? Like I said, I'll give you about 10 seconds for that. One of the things for the fact that most of you are, in the managing risk space, and lessons learned is really a part of what you do your job. So I would expect people in your line of business to get higher scores for this than maybe you might get in other parts of the organization. So here we did have 57% in that middle area. And it's good to see that 27%. So here is where it would be really interesting, like I said, to, if you did this assessment with a larger audience, what that might look like in different parts of the organization. The next one has to do with helping people to get to know each other. So to what extent does your organization encourage people to get to know each other and to talk to each other, maybe even outside of the teams, outside of your meetings? And again, about 2 more seconds. I think this is the highest score for 90% or more of the time. So that's very encouraging to see. I guess I needed to share it again. Sorry, there's a lot of clicking going on to making this happen. So yeah, 39% of you said that you do this 90% or more of the time. Otherwise, the other two are pretty close to each other. And the last one for this, to what extent do you have, a knowledge management system that's formalized, something that you can access? I almost like to call it, a library in some cases. And really looking at how information is shared. All right, let's go ahead and close this. Here is where, interestingly enough, a lot of you have chosen the 46% for the 0 to 49% of the time, with the other 46% of you doing, that 50 to 89% of the time. And it's really, really interesting that this is pretty common, that organizations and your leadership expects you to collaborate and work together and to do good things and to be learning and sharing, but they haven't created a system for you to do that. And so here is where you often see a place where you can get, where you can show some improvement here by just formalizing what that looks like. And by the way, if you do have questions moving through, like I did with the other two, go ahead and ask them, and I'm happy to take them as they come. So next we're going to look at the dimension 3 of organization infrastructure and look at the workforce itself. So the question or the outcome statement that you're trying to get to is that your organization implements systems to increase workforce capacity to handle stress, to increase engagement, and being able to manage during times of continuous change. Interestingly, each of us comes with our own strengths and weaknesses, our own foibles. And we had a person on the I-Corps team that worked for us for I think about 10 years. And we were just reorganizing the office and where the tables were and how we were setting up. And we're a smaller organization. So we were just looking at how can we kind of rearrange and do things. And we had one employee that said, you can do whatever you want, just don't make me move. I just want to stay right here where I am. And so, for some people, change itself causes stress. For most of us, change causes stress. And so when we're living in times that have a lot of change happening very quickly, we really need to help our people to expand their capacity to handle stress itself. And the more you have engagement, the more stress is actually relieved as well. So that increasing engagement helps to manage stress as an outcome. We know that there's study after study that shares the importance of employee engagement and how to do that and why it's important and how it benefits the organization. And employee engagement helps people to stay at your company and helps them to, be more efficient at what they do at their jobs, as well as to be happy while they're doing it, which is denoted here by the happy faces. And so what does that look like? Well, people who are engaged know what's expected of them at work. They're feeling comfortable with what they need to do to be successful. And they have the opportunity to do their best every day, meaning that they don't feel frustrated at the end of the day because they were able to do a good job. There weren't obstacles in their way, or like, yeah, I'm supposed to get my job done. I had 8 meetings today in 7 hours. How am I supposed to actually get any work done? So it is tricky to do your best if you're not actually able to do that work during the day. And a lot of it here, especially if you're younger, I'm not throwing any stones against us older people, but this idea that the mission or purpose of the organizations makes me feel like my job is important. And you're seeing this more and more when newer people to the workforce are interviewing companies because they want to work for companies that their purpose is aligned to. And then in the past year, I've had opportunities at work to learn and grow. Do you actually get time to think about I was just reading the question. Have you had time to think about how you can learn and grow? The next question has to do with taking, one comment was, I would take this assessment twice, looking at how our department interacts internally and once for how we interact with each other. That's a fair question. Mark says some of these questions seem to have good or bad judgments. Looking at if they're more neutral in nature. Interestingly enough, like for example, a lot of these questions come from established surveys on employee engagement, for example. So, and the questions themselves, the criteria of themselves comes from what do more resilient organizations look like and how do they operate and what is being seen as what's helping them to be stronger. So I would say almost every one of these questions comes from some sort of study or from other metrics that are being used to measure organizations. So what we're looking for as a capability for organizations that are trying to build a stronger or more resilient workforce is that you implement employee wellness programs. And I know if you've been on other webinars, you've heard me say this before, but when I started in the workplace, nobody cared about employee wellness. And in fact, we were just thrilled if we got health insurance. But this idea that employee wellness is very, very important and that it helps keep your people healthy and helps them to stay active and positive at work. So looking at both the physical and mental health, that you've got coaching and mentoring programs for everybody, not just for some people. And that the work environment itself is flexible, humanistic, and inclusive, which to me, that's the hardest piece of this. This capability actually has 3 plus 3 actual capabilities tied to it. So this is a more complex one, but it does then tie out under adaptable and flexible that the environment itself is flexible, humanistic, and inclusive. And this is going to be determined by what kind of job you have too. If you're working in an office environment versus working in a production environment, that's going to look different. If you're working in a data center or in an IT structure, it's going to look different than if somebody is in a laboratory. So just understanding that these environments, some of them can be more flexible than others. When we're looking at being inclusive and collaborative, to what extent does leadership ensure that employees are embraced and empowered to make meaningful contributions? This is where we get back to that being inclusive and collaborative. Then to what extent does your organization seek out cognitive diversity as well as other forms of diversity to help intentionally increase its problem-solving capabilities and management of change? I was talking to a friend of mine the other day and she had to take like 3 or 4 different tests just in the application process for a new job. And she said a lot of it had to do with diversity and that it wasn't about like that she was a woman or a woman of color or an age. It had to do with how she thought. And looking at that cognitive diversity becomes really, really important because we all try to, we all get along with people who are similar to ourselves. And so making sure that isn't impacting how we do our hiring. Under aware and reflective, looking at your mentoring programs, do they encourage reflection? Do you actually have time in if you have a mentoring program, do you have time in that program to encourage reflection? And does that mentoring program encourage the sharing of learning to helping you to be more creative and innovative? And then this is the hard part, the last one is demonstrate appreciation for employees' non-work demands, responsibilities, and interests. Sometimes, as a leader of an organization, I feel like saying sometimes, just get the work done. I'm sorry that you're having a rough day, but just get the work done. And if you do that every day, you're going to lose your people. And so trying to balance the fact that you need to get the work done with understanding that your employees are people and they need to be treated as people, human, is also important. So let's get to our next 3 questions. This has to do with, what do your wellness programs include? About 3 more seconds. This is actually really exciting to see that 50% of you, 57% of you said that your wellness programs include these things 90% or more of the time. I think if you'd asked this question 5 and 10 years ago, you would see very different pieces. And if you're at the 0 to 49% of the time, my question to you is, are you looking for a different job? Because I think it might be hard to work for a company that doesn't think about you as a person. The next poll, looking at your work environment itself. Now, if your work environment is your home, that's the physical work environment, but you're also looking at, the work itself that you're doing, not just the building where you're working. All right, this one also gave very high scores for 90% or more of the time. And I am happy to see that only 8% of you weren't able to do that. And then the last poll for this one, that your leadership demonstrates appreciation for your extended life outside of work as well. All right, about 2 more seconds. And again, you guys gave some pretty high scores, 52% of you for 90% or more of the time. So if I was, conducting this assessment at your organization, and pretending that all of you were in the same organization, I would surmise that most of you are pretty happy at work and that you're finding the work satisfactory and that your company is taking decent care of you. All right, let's get to dimension 4. We're going to jump to preparedness and managing risk, and we're going to look at the strategy itself, that to what extent does your organization manage risk. And the outcome statement for managing risk is that you're implementing systems to ensure that risk is effectively managed throughout the organization. So note that you're looking at more of a systematic approach to managing risk. And if you want to think back to that silo, or if you want to think about the sharks and you're in the boat. So that there's lots of different types of risk. We're just noting a few of them here. First one is more strategic risk, about where your organization's going, what it sells, what it produces, and how it works in that greater ecosystem, to making sure that what we're selling is something that is going to continue to be sold. Much broader than that, of course. And looking at compliance risk, there are all sorts of regulations depending on what your work is and where you work to look at that compliance side of things. Of course, financial risk is a huge industry all on its own. And then reputational risk. But where we probably most of us fit is in this operational piece. And so when you're looking at systems, you may be challenged by saying, well, we're just trying to get our operational risk to work as a system, much less the rest of those. And that's a valid point. So really, when we're looking at how well organizations manage risk, we start with operational risk. And to look at the fact that it's hard enough to get the operational side of things unsiloed. The question that just came is that, we're just running through a few questions here. Yeah, if you've ever conducted a business impact analysis, it's similar to that. And we'll be talking more about process as we go through during the next few months. But essentially, we have the questions that are asked are questions that we asked to leadership, and that's done through interviews, and we try to do it with the whole leadership team or as much of the leadership team or steering committee type of group as you can at the same time. And then the other questions are answered through surveys, and then you bring those together, and then you go back to leadership and you talk about the gaps that you see in your responses, and that's what creates the really interesting piece of this. It takes we don't suggest doing this at all one sitting, especially for the interviews that you do this over several different days, or it might take you as much as a month, to get through some of this, just because of the time. The scheduling of it becomes a challenge. So I did pick for this one capability 58 for business continuity management. This is the definition under ISO 22301, that the organization has the capability to ensure that its critical activities will continue to operate at predetermined levels and predetermined capacity during a disruptive incident. That is what your goal is as people in business continuity. And so when we're looking at what does that look like to be adaptable and flexible? So capability behavior number 33 is that those responsible for collecting risk and impact data do so in an interactive manner, ensuring that the data is current, credible, consistent, complete, and correct. When we're looking at being inclusive and collaborative, we're then looking at your strategies and solutions, but that the ones that are selected are inclusive and meet the needs of all your interested parties, and that you've identified those through collaborative means. Looking at the behavior of diverse and integrated, that your risk and impact data is collected from all relevant interested parties, both vertically and horizontally throughout the organization, as well as those outside of your organization. Understanding that your suppliers and different people are going to need to be part of that data collection. That everyone in the organization is aware of the VCMS and their role in ensuring that it's effectively implemented. These are actual requirements from ISO 22301. Number 34, that the overall business continuity strategy supports the needed resource requirements and that they meet the organization's objectives. And then the final one, under prepared, robust, and redundant, is that your plan documents themselves are specific regarding immediate steps, that they're flexible in responding to changing circumstances, and that they're effective in minimizing impact. Oops, sorry, I double-clicked there. So let's look at your questions that have to do with those. All right, about 2 more seconds. So here's my question is, I would assume that a significant number of you are business continuity people. And so I would have expected you to score yourselves higher on this. But it is really interesting. Sometimes we actually critique ourselves a little bit more too. But the highest score was, 50 to 89% of the time. And I think that is probably a pretty accurate description of how most systems are, or for business continuity systems. And then next, we're going to look at how you collect your data and what that looks like. We're not even talking about how often you collect the data. That's another whole question. All right. And here your answers are pretty evenly distributed. So if you're benchmarking, you're not going to get a lot of answers because it's pretty even amongst everyone. And then the final one for this section, looking at your business continuity strategy and how well it's aligned to the strategic objectives of the organization. I remember back in the days when I was a business continuity consultant and we were hired to do a business impact analysis in order to identify some strategies. And we were told at the front end that we needed to make sure that it included getting a generator. In the end, they didn't really need a generator, but the facilities person really wanted it. So it's sometimes interesting, in this case, they didn't have the need for a generator because they didn't have the downtime to support that. But it was sort of interesting. So here you're almost at 50% for that your strategies support that. If I was looking at improvement for this, you would want to make sure that your strategies really support the business strategy. And if you're trying to sell this to leadership, I would hope that you could do that 90% or more of the time. And so if you're looking critically at what it is that you're supporting, and part of that might be because you're not allowed, like the company says no, that they're not going to spend the money to do that. But it is part of selling, the business continuity strategies themselves, is that they're supporting the overall business strategy. All right, let's go to our final dimension. So here I'm going to stress your mind a little bit because we're going to talk about innovation and continual improvement, but we're going to look at this from the perspective of the resilience of your community. And so the question or the outcome statement is that the organization considers the capabilities of the community or communities where its facilities operate to meet its needs and expectations. And here it might be, you might have a call center in another country, for example. You might have manufacturing plants in different countries. And sometimes those decisions are made for financial reasons. And then the question becomes, do they have the capabilities that you need? We're seeing a lot of challenges with supply chains. The tariffs that the US has put into place with other countries has impacted those communities, and the ability for them, to allow you to bring that product into the US if you're from the US. So looking at this is a big deal. And a lot of times the decisions are made purely from, you can get workers for less money, you don't have the overhead, all of those sorts of things. And as we're looking at more resilient organizations, we're seeing that they have to look at their entire ecosystem and everywhere where they touch with their work, and to make sure that they're looking at all these risk areas and that they're making decisions to make sure that the organization is protected. So the question on the table sometimes is, why does the resilience of your community matter? Well, the infrastructure of that community is going to impact how many resources they have and how prepared that they are for the unknown. Even if you just look simply at natural disasters, and just how much money that community has in order to do more things that help you to be more prepared. and understanding that each person in a community, each organization, and the government entities impacted by the capabilities of that community itself. And also to think about it, you know, each organization has a responsibility to be as resilient as possible so that it does not negatively impact the resilience of the community itself. So, you know, if you work in education and the schools are closed, okay, now we have workarounds where we can have students work from home, which I'm sure if you have kids, you really appreciate that. Now you're not no longer doing your job, you're helping your kids on their computers. If you're in a community that your kids, you know, a lot of kids don't have computers and they can't get out, but also looking at, you know, what happens if your financial institutions aren't robust? What happens if your transportation systems aren't working? What happens if you're part of the transportation system and you break? It's going to mess things up. If you're have a manufacturing plant or you're a big hirer for that community and a lot of people in your community depend on you for their jobs, we do have a responsibility to that community itself. We're seeing this more and more in the food industry, where there's only certain places, and I think you also see it when you have different minerals as well in the technology industry, but where you have to build whole communities around a product like chocolate, for example, in order to be able to, because the chocolate's in a certain place, and same thing with the minerals, you have to be able to get them where they're at. And so if you've built this whole community and then you leave, now you've left this community with no resources. So this final capability, number 75, is very complex. There's several capabilities tied into this. That number one, the community is prepared to respond to risk, that it has planned and funded risk reduction activities, networks, and partnerships to provide support in times of need. And I've been working for several years on a standard on community resilience. Its number is ISO 22354. And it's really been interesting work where it's all about building these community partnerships and these local partnerships where they can be really called on. And I'm going to call out here, I'm a native Minnesotan, grew up in Minneapolis, Minnesota. And after the you know, the Floyd piece, back in 2020, community members started forming community groups so that if there was some sort of problem like this in the future, they would be ready. And the churches and community groups formed themselves. And a lot of just regular people formed these groups. And those groups are what helped just basic people to get out, and they're continuing to get out in Minneapolis to work against the ICE agents. And I don't know what your opinions are about the whole political side of this, but the idea here is that they had pre-formed community partnerships and networks, and they were able to centralize themselves and decentralize themselves in order to provide that support in times of need. And if we can leverage that model for a community disaster of some kind, that's maybe not caused by your government, but it's caused by a natural disaster or something else, I think it's a model that we need to, and it really took everything from that standard that we wrote that should be published soon and made it real. It made it real in my eyes, where we were talking about theoretical things, and all of a sudden here we could see it happening. And then educating our community members on how to be more prepared. There's been lots and lots of examples of how that's done. And most communities don't do this, but recognizing organizations that are doing what they need to do to be prepared. There were several of these initiatives years ago in the United States that have kind of fizzled out, but they were really interesting, where there was recognition given to organizations by community members, community leaders, I should say. So a behavior outcome for inclusive and collaborative is that information is shared and understood by community members, with the knowledge exchanged between leaders and members to determine what best practice should be for their community. That members of the community know what to do during unexpected events and are adequately provisioned to act, learn, and adapt. most communities now at least have the caller system where that, you know, you get a phone call saying that there's a tornado or natural disaster on the way, or that a road has been closed, or certain government services won't be available due to whatever. This isn't happening everywhere in the world, but it is happening quite a bit in the United States and Europe. When we're looking at being resourceful, that community leaders themselves are investing in research and data collection and risk monitoring to enable evidence-based decision-making to make better decisions during those changing circumstances. And then finally, the organization supports how the community manages and responds to risk, providing services as they're able to increase the resilience of the community itself. So here, the last one is looking at making sure that the community, the organization itself is contributing to its highest extent. So here you can also see with the behaviors, you know, here there's 57 behaviors for inclusive and collaborative, there's 47 for aware and reflective, there's 44 for resourceful, and there's 42 for the prepared, robust, and redundant. So to finish up our polls, the first one is that the community is prepared to respond to risk. I'm just acknowledging the last comment that's saying this is a big deal. It is, and it feels like what's happening in your community is outside of your control, but it's really, really important that your organization looks at the capabilities of the community itself. And here is pretty much reflected here is when you see about 60% are in the middle, which is actually higher than what I thought it would be. And this might change based on the countries represented here today. And you might not even be aware of how much your community invests in research and data collection. Some of these questions, here's the other piece of the process of this, is you're not going to ask every one of these questions to every one of these people. There might be, because we might not know. So you have to make sure that you're asking the questions to the right people. So again, it looks like about 37% of you said, you know, gave a 1. 47%, kind of about half of you were in the 2 range. And to finish up with our last question, the organization supports how the community manages and responds to risk. So it's tying back to what extent does your organization contribute to reducing risk in the community, and being as strong as it can be to make sure that it's contributing in the way that it needs to. All right, let me go ahead and show this. And this one came about even all the way across the board again. Well, this gives you, you know, an example of how kind of a snapshot of what some of these questions look like. We do have about 2 minutes left. I did answer all the questions that are in there so far. So if you have a question, go ahead and put it in the question box. Just a reminder that part of what we have found is that a couple of you asked the question was, well, if we're more informed, we might be able to answer these questions differently. So our education program and our certification program for increasing organizational resilience teaches you about each one of these dimensions and teaches you what those things look like through case studies and best practices. And that's some of what we've pulled out from our education program that we've found and pulled that into the capability assessment. Just as a reminder, next month we're going to talk about leadership and strategy metrics. And we just thank you for participating. And these webinars this year, we will have to make sure that we've got time for your participation. And when we get to the case studies, they'll be a little more interactive as well. you have any other questions, feel free to reach out after the webinar, and enjoy the rest of your day.